So, the European Union has just rolled out one of the most ambitious and honestly most controversial climate policies on the planet. It's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM for short. Now, on the surface, it's supposed to be this amazing tool to fight climate change, but for a lot of countries looking in from the outside, it feels a whole lot more like a trade weapon. So, what's the real story here? Let's get into it.
And that's really the big question, isn't it? Is this a fair way to make sure everyone's playing by the same climate rules, or is it just protectionism dressed up in green clothing? We're going to see that the real answer, well, it isn't really hidden in the legal jargon of the law itself. It's found in the day-to-day experience of the businesses that actually have to deal with it. Okay, so before we dive into all the controversy, we first have to understand the problem the EU says it's trying to fix. And that problem has this very specific name: carbon leakage. And the logic, it makes sense. If you're the EU and you put a really high price on carbon, what's to stop a big steel company from just packing up and moving its factory to a country that has, let's say, looser environmental laws? Well, if that happens, the EU loses jobs. And worse, global emissions don't actually go down. They might even go up. The CBAM is supposed to be the fix for that exact problem. And this right here, this is where we get to the heart of the matter. There's this huge gap between the theory of the law and the reality of what it's like for a company trying to export their goods. Because how a rule is felt on the ground often matters a whole lot more than how it's written on a piece of paper. I mean, you look at the rule on paper and it seems totally fair. It says it's non-discriminatory, right? It applies the same carbon price to a company in Germany as it does to a company in India. But in practice, this isn't about some high-minded principles. It's about invoices, spreadsheets, and endless data. And as we all know, whoever sets the standards, whoever controls the paperwork, that's who has the real power. So, here's the kicker. The EU holds all the cards. It decides, all by itself, what the carbon price is going to be. It decides what counts as good enough emissions data. And this is a huge one, it alone decides which carbon payments you might have already made in your own country are good enough to get a discount. This isn't a two-way conversation, it's a one-way street. All right, let's stop talking in the abstract. Let's really put ourselves in the shoes of a company trying to sell its products in Europe. We're going to walk through 3 specific, concrete hurdles they face. And this is where that feeling of being pressured really starts to build. So, the very first hurdle, it's the price itself. If you're an exporter, the carbon price you have to pay is tied to the EU's internal market. That price goes up and down every single day based on EU politics and market swings that you have absolutely zero control over. The source we're looking at uses this fantastic analogy of a weighing scale. Think about it. On one side, you have your factory's emissions. Changing that takes massive investment and time. On the other side is the EU's carbon price, which can change dramatically from one week to the next. You're basically being asked to balance a scale where someone else is constantly adding or removing weight from the other side.
All right, hurdle number 2, and honestly, this one's a big one. Let's say your company is already doing the right thing and paying a carbon tax in your home country. You'd think, great, I can just subtract that from my EU bill. But it's really not that simple.
Here's another great analogy. Picture 2 columns. In the first, really tall column, you've got all the different costs your business pays for climate action back home. But in the second, much shorter column, you have what the EU actually recognizes as a valid carbon price. And that huge gap between them, the source says that's not a bug, it's a feature. The system is intentionally designed to only recognize policies that look exactly like the EU's own system. And we're not just talking hypotheticals here. Look at these real-world examples. Tons of countries use things like taxes on coal, special fees for energy, or rules that force companies to buy renewable power. These are all legitimate climate policies, but under the CBAM rules, they often don't count for a deduction. So what happens? Companies get hit twice. They pay once at home, and then they pay again at the EU border. And that brings us to the third hurdle, which is really all about fairness. Think about it. Companies inside the EU, they get all kinds of help to deal with these high carbon prices. Subsidies, free allowances, you name it. But exporters from outside the EU, they're expected to face that exact same high price with none of that support system in place. This analogy of the 2 runners just nails it perfectly. You've got one runner who has fancy shoes, water stations, coaches, and a smooth paved track. The other runner is barefoot on rocky ground. Then someone stands at the end and says, hey, the race is totally fair because the finish line is the same for both of you. It completely ignores the fact that their journeys to get there are wildly different. So when you add all these hurdles up, Hurdle 1, Hurdle 2, Hurdle 3. What's the cumulative effect? What's the unspoken message they're really sending to businesses and governments all around the world? Well, the math of the whole thing sends a super clear signal. Having a small token carbon tax in your home country isn't going to help you much. The only way to really meaningfully lower your CBAM bill is to make your domestic carbon price almost identical to the one in the EU. In other words, the message is, be like us. And you can see how this puts governments, especially in developing nations, in a truly impossible situation. What do you do? Do you raise energy prices on your own citizens to match Europe's and risk massive political unrest? Or do you just let your most important export industries get hammered with these penalties? It's a classic choice between a rock and a hard place.
Okay, so let's tie this all together and get to the final verdict. How does a policy that was designed to foster global cooperation end up feeling so much like coercion?
See, the power here isn't in an outright ban. The EU isn't saying you can't sell here. No, the key phrase is conditional access. They're saying, sure, you can sell your goods here, but your ability to compete, to make a profit, is now entirely dependent on how closely your country's climate rules align with our rules. That's an incredibly powerful form of pressure, all applied through the marketplace.
And for many, what feels fundamentally backward is the sequence of events. You'd think a real climate partnership would start with sharing green technology, providing financing, helping countries build capacity. Instead, the CBAM starts with the punishment, the price, and then just hopes that cooperation will magically follow later.
So we're going to end on this really powerful thought from the source material. Is the CBAM a neutral climate tool? Maybe on paper, but in practice, the way it's lived, it acts more like a lesson in alignment taught through spreadsheets and invoices. And it leaves us with a really important question. In this global fight against climate change, where do we draw the line between leadership and leverage?